9 out of 52. That's how many cosmetics tested positive for asbestos when the FDA finally checked in 2019. So the government proposed mandatory testing. November 2025, that rule was quietly killed. Right now, 8 foundation brands you need to stop buying have no one verifying what's inside them, and what 3 dermatologists found when they looked tells a very different story than the labels do. In 2019, the FDA set out to answer a question most shoppers would never think to ask. Is there asbestos in everyday makeup? The agency purchased 52 talc-based cosmetic products from stores across the United States and sent them for laboratory analysis. Each sample underwent polarized light microscopy, a first step for spotting suspicious mineral fibers. But because asbestos can hide in forms too fine for ordinary microscopes, the FDA required confirmation using transmission electron microscopy, an advanced method that can detect even the thinnest asbestiform fibers. The results were stark. 9 out of 52 products tested positive for asbestos. The FDA's summary didn't just list brands, it included batch numbers and the specific type of asbestos found, such as chrysotile or tremolite. These are minerals with a long documented link to cancers like mesothelioma and ovarian cancer, even at very low exposures. The agency published its findings in a public report, but there was no sweeping recall. Under United States law, the FDA cannot force cosmetic companies to remove contaminated products from shelves. Instead, the agency could only request that brands voluntarily withdraw the affected batches. Dr. John C. Mack, a senior scientist at the FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, explained the process. PLM gives you the first indication, but only TEM can confirm asbestos at the levels that really matter for consumer safety. This 2-step testing protocol set a new benchmark for cosmetic safety, but it also exposed a major flaw. Without mandatory testing or recall authority, the responsibility for safety falls back on manufacturers. The FDA's own data showed the risk is real, and for those 9 products, the hazard was no longer theoretical. Asbestos was officially confirmed in makeup sold to American consumers. On December 27, 2024, the FDA published a proposed rule in the Federal Register that would have required every manufacturer selling talc-based cosmetics in the United States to test each batch for asbestos using the most advanced laboratory methods available. The agency pointed to the health benefits of this move, reducing cases of mesothelioma, ovarian, and lung cancer, though it stopped short of providing exact numbers. The rule was designed as a direct answer to the agency's own findings. Asbestos fibers, confirmed in popular makeup brands, had been sold to unwitting consumers. Standardized testing, using both polarized light and transmission electron microscopy, was set to become the new baseline for safety. But less than a year later, on November 28, 2025, the FDA withdrawn the proposal. The withdrawal notice, signed by Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., appeared in the Federal Register as Entry 90, FR 54603. The agency described the move as a re-examination, leaving the door open for a future rule, but immediately erasing the only pending federal requirement for asbestos screening in cosmetics. Consumer advocates called the withdrawal a public health setback, warning that the absence of a mandatory testing rule leaves the market wide open for contaminated products. Legal industry alerts circulated among cosmetics manufacturers, flagging the potential for a wave of consumer lawsuits if the rule had passed. Cosmetics trade groups had lobbied hard against the proposal, arguing that mandatory batch testing would impose unnecessary cost and burden. With the proposal off the table, no federal law compels brands to test for asbestos or to pull contaminated batches from shelves. The regulatory safety net, briefly within reach, vanished, leaving ingredient safety and transparency up to the discretion of each brand. A stroll down the drugstore makeup aisle can feel safe, even routine, but the hazards aren't reserved for high-end brands. Everyday favorites like Maybelline Fit Me Matte Powder and CoverGirl Clean Fresh have raised alarms among scientists and advocates. Dr. Alan Cho, a cosmetic chemist, points to recent studies showing that over half of tested foundations contained high levels of fluorine, a red flag for PFAS, the so-called forever chemicals. Maybelline's Fit Me Matte Powder lists talc as its first ingredient, putting it at the center of 2 concerns: talc's contamination risk and the potential for hidden PFA, though the full lab data behind these claims remains out of public reach. CoverGirl's Clean Fresh line, marketed as Clean, faced a class action lawsuit after an EPA-certified lab reported more than 6,000 parts per million of organic fluorine in the product. Rebecca Holt, a consumer attorney, explains that U.S. law doesn't actually define clean for cosmetics, leaving brands free to use the term as long as their claims aren't outright false. For shoppers, this means that even the most affordable, familiar brands can hide risks behind a wall of marketing and regulatory loopholes. Brand loyalty often blurs the line between heritage and safety. Neutrogena, once part of Johnson & Johnson, now sits under Kenvue after a 2023 corporate spinoff. But the legal baggage didn't disappear. More than 66,000 lawsuits over talc-based products remain active, including a $1.5 billion verdict from a Baltimore jury in December 2023. These cases center on claims that asbestos-contaminated talc caused cancer, raising the question of what legacy brands are really protecting: consumer trust or corporate liability. L'Oreal's True Match powder shows how ingredient lists can quietly outpace regulation. In the United States, talc is still the first ingredient, followed by methylparaben and propylparaben, both flagged in European safety guidance for possible endocrine disruption. The European Commission has advised phasing out talc in cosmetics where asbestos risk can't be ruled out, but United States shelves remain unchanged. L'Oreal's 2025 statement promised a future reduction in talc, yet no reformulation has been confirmed for American consumers. Even claims on the package are not all created equal. IT Cosmetics CC Plus Cream advertises 7 benefits, but only one, SPF 50, requires formal substantiation under FDA rules. The rest, like anti-aging or hydrating, fall under the Federal Trade Commission's looser standard for advertising, meaning brands need only reasonable evidence, not rigorous clinical trials. For shoppers, this patchwork of standards means that a trusted name or a familiar label offers little real assurance. The risks are layered, and the burden of proof still falls on buyers, not brands. Avon's name appeared on the FDA's 2019 roster of talc-based cosmetics testing positive for asbestos fibers. The agency's transmission electron microscopy analysis confirmed the presence of both chrysotile and tremolite asbestos in select Avon foundation and baby powder batches. With no federal power to force a recall, the FDA issued a public safety notice, and Avon responded by voluntarily pulling the affected lots from sale in early 2023. The recall was posted on Avon's own website, an action that depended entirely on corporate discretion, not government mandate. Legal consequences for cosmetics brands rarely reach the criminal courts in the United States, but north of the border, Canadian prosecutors took a different approach. In January 2026, the Ontario Superior Court heard the case Environment Canada versus Estée Lauder Companies. The evidence included government lab data showing undisclosed PFAS, persistent bioaccumulative chemicals, in several Estée Lauder foundations sold in Canada. Internal company emails, obtained through a Freedom of Information request, revealed that executives were aware of the PFAS content before the product launch. Estée Lauder entered a guilty plea under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, accepting a financial penalty and a listing on the National Environmental Offenders Registry. The brand announced a reformulation of its Double Wear foundation 3 months later, removing the ingredient linked to the violation. These actions stand in sharp contrast to the U.S. system, where even confirmed asbestos or PFAS findings have not triggered mandatory recalls or criminal charges. For American shoppers, enforcement often depends on where the product is sold and how far regulators are willing to go. Peer-reviewed clinical data brings a rare level of certainty to foundation safety claims. In 2024, Clinique published the results of a controlled trial in the Journal of Cosmetic Dermatology, enrolling 150 adults with sensitive skin. The study protocol required daily application of Clinique's talc-free, fragrance-free foundation for 4 weeks, with participants monitored for adverse reactions by board-certified dermatologists. At the end of the study, not a single subject reported irritation, redness, or allergic response. The full ingredient list was disclosed in the published article, confirming the absence of talc and synthetic fragrance, 2 of the most common triggers for contact dermatitis. This level of transparency and zero-incident outcome stands in sharp contrast to the patchwork evidence and incomplete disclosure that surround most major brands. 3 board-certified dermatologists reviewed Clinique's published clinical trial and ingredient transparency in early 2026. Their endorsement centers on 2 factors: a fully disclosed, talc-free, fragrance-free formula and peer-reviewed data showing no irritation in 150 adults with sensitive skin. Dr. Maya Patel, who supervised the trial, stated, "Full ingredient disclosure and rigorous testing are the foundation of trust. Clinique's formula meets the highest bar for safety." Dr. Alan Cho, a cosmetic chemist and consultant to dermatologists, highlighted the absence of PFAS and parabens, adding, "This is what evidence-based, patient-friendly formulation looks like." Dr. Susan Lee, a practicing dermatologist, explained her reasoning simply. "When patients ask what's safe, I point to brands that publish their data and avoid known irritants. That's why I recommend Clinique." For shoppers, this expert consensus offers a clear, actionable choice in a market crowded with uncertainty. Today, foundation labels promise safety, but ingredient lists and lab reports tell a different story. With no mandatory recalls and minimal oversight, every purchase is a leap of trust. For U.S. shoppers, true protection depends on demanding real transparency, not just glossy marketing. Your skin deserves more than a claim.